Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome, Nan.
Hi, Steve.
You know, Nan, they call Hollywood studios oftentimes the Dream Factory.
Oh, yes.
Which I think is such an appropriate name because it was a little bit of a factory.
Right,
And,
right.
you know, of course, there's the magic and the creativity of what the studios were doing, but it was also a bottom line business.
Right. Very calculated.
Very, very calculated.
Yeah.
And, you know, these moguls who ran these studios, they were so careful in grooming actors and actresses to become stars because,
Right.
of course, stars made money.
And that's what you want.
And that was the bottom line. And so what often happened, and I find this so interesting with the old Hollywood studio moguls, some actor would hit big and become extremely popular with the general public.
Right.
So what do? In going back to their factory mentality, they try to create more.
Yes, exactly.
So oftentimes studios would then groom other stars to be the new version of whatever their hot star of the moment was.
Right.
Which was really interesting. Sometimes they would use them as threats. Like if a star refused roles or threatened to go out on suspension as opposed to doing a role they didn't want, they'd bring in somebody else that kind of looked like them, that had the same appeal. And they would sort of use this as a threat to get them back towing the line.
Yes.
Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about, in this episode, all the actors who basically can thank their career because they either looked like or were a threat or a new version of another bigger star.
Yes. Well, I was fascinated to see how many there were in some of these actors that we think of now as so iconic. Let's dive in with, first of all, Clark Gable.
Yes. You know, once Clark Gable hit, and he hit pretty early in his career and in a huge way.
Right.
Every single studio in town had to get their version of Clark Gable.
Yeah.
Of course, Clark Gable was a huge star at MGM. He was considered the king of MGM. He kind of started out his career. He was this talented kid from a little town in Ohio. His stepmother encouraged him to get into show business, and she helped him. So he finally came to Hollywood, and after his first leading role opposite Joan Crawford in Dance Fools Dance in 1931, Gable was pretty much a bona fide star.
Wow.
And so he had that raw sex appeal, that brutal masculinity. He was a hit with women and men.
I think that is so key. I was thinking about Ryan Gosling.
Yes.
And I was thinking he has that same quality. I think men love him and want to be his friend, and women want to do other things.
Exactly. Well, I think Gable had the same appeal, and Gable also had a great appeal to his leading ladies because he slept with a lot of them.
Yeah, and they all kind of fell in love with him.
Joan Crawford, Marion Davies, Paulette Goddard, Lana Turner, Grace Kelly, and eventually he married Carole Lombard.
Yes.
So he was quite the ladies' man. He was quite the stud. All the guys wanted to be him. Well, once he hit, every studio in town wanted one. And so Warner Brothers, they had their version of Clark Gable in a wonderful English-born actor named Patrick Knowles.
Well, what's interesting about Patrick Knowles is I think I have been confusing him with Errol Flynn all these years because they look so much alike. So when I was watching Three Came Home,
yeah.
and I kept looking at that actor and thinking, well, no, it's not. And then I had to look at him. I was like, Patrick Knowles. Oh my gosh, yes.
Knowles had that same matinee idol good looks and that sex appeal, and he was already a star in London.
Yes.
You know, when he arrived in Hollywood with his wife in 1936. And his American film debut, it was a second lead behind George Brent and Kay Francis in the soapy romance called Give Me Your Heart.
Okay.
1936. His second film, which really put him on the map, was playing the younger brother of Errol Flynn.
Charge of the Light Brigade.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Also 36.
Yeah.
He was finally given top billing in this B romantic comedy called Expensive Husbands.
Oh, that's an interesting time. Have you seen that?
I've never seen
never seen it
I don't
either.
know it. That was his first leading role. And this is when they're really trying to pit him against Clark Gable and give Gable a run for his money.
Right.
But after a couple of more leads, it became clear that Knowles just wasn't a leading man. He was more of a second lead. He was more of the best friend or the supportive co-star. And that's a role that he seemed to embrace in his career. He liked taking those types of roles, and eventually he kind of downgraded back to those types of roles as well.
He didn't have that hunting and fishing kind of, masculinity that,
I'm going
that
to
Clark
kill a
Gable
rhino,
did.
and
Right.
of course, Knowles had a really good Hollywood career. Again, he was with Errol Flynn in The Adventures of Robin Hood. He was in Four's a Crowd. He was in The Sisters. He did a lot of interesting movies. He even has a small part as one of Maureen O'Hara's brothers in the John Ford Oscar-winning film How Green Was My Valley
Wow.
in 1941. So he did have a career. It just wasn't, he never really proved that big of a threat for Clark Gable.
Yes, yes. Films that he was in, a lot of them were pretty popular titles. I mean, Of Human Bondage
Yes.
with Eleanor Parker.
The remake, right.
Yeah. As we said, Three Came Home, The Big Steal
The Big
with Robert
Steal.
Mitchum.
Great movie, too.
Yeah. So, it's interesting that he did have this career, but he's not a household name by any stretch of the imagination.
I mean, if you ask anybody on the street today who Patrick Knowles is, nobody probably, except for you and me and Lindsay, know who he is.
Now, he did end up doing a movie with Clark Gable.
He did, which is interesting.
Band of Angels in 1957, and he goes toe-to-toe with Clark Gable, and guess who wins?
Clark Gable.
Yeah, Clark Gable,
Yeah,
of
in
course.
the end, Clark Gable ends up with Yvonne DiCarlo, not Patrick Knowles.
Yeah. Let's jump into another one, John Lund, who we have briefly talked about
We have
before.
briefly, and I really, really like John Lund. This was sort of Paramount Pictures' horse in the race.
Okay.
This was their version of their
it.
king.
A little rougher around the edges.
Yes, he was a little rough around the edges. He came from Broadway. He actually had a very successful Broadway career before Paramount found him and put him under contract. His film debut was quite a doozy. He plays this incredible dual role of Olivia de Havilland's lover and later her grown son in To Each His Own in 1946.
Wow.
Which of course this is the film that de Havilland won her first Best Actress Oscar. And it also gave Lund wide exposure, wide praise,
Yes.
really put him on the map.
So he also then appears in Billy Wilder's Foreign Affair in 1948, opposite somebody else who we're going to talk about later, Marlene Dietrich and Jean Arthur, and then No Man of Her Own.
Which is Nikki Dukas's film.
Yes,
that she
Barbara
recommended.
Stanwyck. So he's got quite a career going, but he finds himself soon thereafter in some B-Westerns and then Republic Pictures,
Yes.
and that's never a good sign.
Yeah, that's kind of where the faded stars go to die, is Republic at that point. It's funny, Lund, he had all the prerequisite good looks. He had the mustache.
Yes.
You had to have the mustache. But he just didn't have that intangible spark, I think, that Clark Gable had. And that's why his career never really took off to the stratosphere like Gable's did.
I love that he did get one last high-profile role in High Society with Grace Kelly.
That's right.
The musical remake of Philadelphia Story. And he was an active vice president, actually, in the Screen Actors Guild.
Yeah, very involved in SAG early on.
Now, there's another Gable wannabe that we want to talk about, and this is the one that comes maybe the closest to capturing that aura that Clark Gable had, and that is James Craig.
Yes, big fan of James Craig. I think despite being groomed to be the new Clark Gable, he's one of the few that actually got out from under that looming shadow and actually made a career of his own.
And he even tested for Gone with the Wind, right? He
did.
tested for the Rhett Butler role.
He did. So he was competing head to head with Clark Gable before he became the studio's idea of
Clark Gable.
the next Clark Gable.
Right.
James Craig, he had that same kind of fun-loving, roguish charm that Clark Gable had, and he used it to great advantage in movies. When he first got to Hollywood, things didn't go so well for James Craig, so he hightailed it to Broadway, which was really smart because he appeared in several Broadway plays that were quite successful, one being Missouri Legend, which was a play that featured Jose Ferrer and Dorothy Gish Beach and Dean Jagger and Mildred Natwick, Carl Malden, and Dan Duryea. What a cast.
Yeah, so he's going to get some exposure through that.
He did. And so, of course, the minute you hit big on Broadway,
right.
Hollywood wants
Everybody
you back.
wants you. So he comes back and he goes to Columbia Pictures.
Yes, he did go to Columbia, where he was given leads in this B picture called North of Shanghai in 1939. And then after this leading role, he was otherwise kind of wasted at Columbia. They didn't really do much for him. They put him in some supporting roles in some very forgettable films. But his real lucky break came when he was lent to RKO and cast as Ginger Rogers' solid but very dull fiancée in Kitty Foyle, 1940, which of course is the film that Ginger Rogers won the Oscar for. And this elevated James Craig to leading man status.
Right, right. So he follows that with The Devil and Daniel Webster in 1941, with Walter Huston, Valley of the Sun, a Western with Lucille Ball.
With Lucille Ball.
And Friendly Enemies in 1942 with Charles Ruggles. So at this point, Carol Lombard has tragically been killed in a plane crash with her mother. At this point, she had been married to Clark Gable. And there are reports that he decided after that to enlist in the armed forces. So Louis B. Mayer is basically without his king. Yeah, his king is gone. And so he personally recruits Craig to MGM and puts him under a 7-year contract.
Yeah, I mean, I think Louis B. Mayer really saw the potential in James Craig. And he thought if anybody can fill the void of missing Clark Gable, it's James Craig.
Right.
At MGM, he started out as a leading man immediately in westerns like The Omaha Trail, Northwest Rangers. Then he moved on to some better movies like The Human Comedy, which if you've never seen that movie, it's such a great movie, 1943. It's with Mickey Rooney, Marcia Hunt, Donna Reed. He's also in Lost Angel, again with Marcia Hunt and Margaret O'Brien. And he's also in Kismet, where he plays a supporting role to Ronald Colman and Marlene Dietrich.
Right. So after that, he moves on to playing opposite Lana Turner in Marriage is a Private Affair in 1944 and Donna Reed, 1945. And then he does Our Vines Have Tender Grapes in 1945. We've talked about
that movie.
We keep it on the DVR, actually, so we can just go back
such a great
and
movie.
watch it with Edward G. Robinson and Margaret O'Brien. But Clark Gable comes back from the war.
And guess what happened?
There's
only room for one king at MGM.
Oh, darn it. So he did continue to work, but in smaller roles and films that are less interesting.
Yeah, but he had his moment. But I think of all of these Clark Gable wannabes, James Craig is the one that actually became a really good actor and formed his own personality as a performer on his own.
Yeah, so he's the one to check out.
And there were certainly others like John Sutton and Preston Foster, Kent Taylor, John Carroll. They also vied for the title of the new king. But we don't have time for them.
Yeah, we don't have time right now. Let's move on to some actresses. So I would love to hear your take on who were the wannabes for the Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich roles, because those two ladies kind of came up at the same time. They became very famous at the same time, and they're that exotic, beauty, mysterious, silent type.
It's interesting with Garbo and Dietrich, they were so specific and they were such a unique type that of course they're going to try to be replicated.
Yes.
And we've talked about her many times on the podcast, but one of the women that Louis B. Mayer tried to bring to Hollywood to sort of compete with them was Louise Reiner.
Right.
We won't even talk about her. We talked about her so much.
We won't talk about her at all. She did win 2 Oscars,
She won a couple of Oscars that she didn't quite deserve, and she was this fluttery, a very quirky actress who ultimately left Hollywood and said that it was sort of an intellectual wasteland. So that's enough for Louise Reiner. But an interesting actress that actually Samuel Goldwyn brought to the table was an actress named Anna Sten.
Yes.
Samuel Goldwyn was determined to find a new Garbo, and he thought he'd found her in this Russian-born actress. She'd appeared in this German film in 1931. It got his attention, so he was convinced she had those special qualities.
Right.
So he whisked her off to Hollywood, where he bought the rights to Emile Zola's tragic novel, Nana.
Okay.
This was going to be her American film debut. The film had all the elements to make her a star. They had tragic themes and melodrama and sexy subject matters and the stellar supporting cast, which also included Lionel Atwood, Richard Bennett, and Mae Clarke.
But there was one problem.
There was only one big problem is that Anna Sten didn't really speak English that well.
Which is a little difficult.
Yeah, so in fact, Goldwyn spent a fortune trying to teach this woman proper English.
Okay.
It's even lampooned in the Cole Porter hit Anything Goes. There's lyrics that say, when Samuel Goldwyn can with great conviction instruct Anna Sten in diction, then Anna shows anything goes.
Oh my gosh. If you've made Cole Porter's lyrics, there's a lot of talk going on about you.
All of Hollywood was talking about the great discovery of Goldwyn, who didn't really speak English.
Well, she goes on in 1934. She makes another movie, but it's also a bomb, right?
Yeah, because Nana was a bomb. It came out and bombed, but she did another movie called We Live Again in 34.
Right.
And also in 35, she did a movie called The Wedding Night. Both were opposite Gary Cooper. Both were box office bombs.
Wow. So Goldwyn now.
Yeah, what's the common denominator?
Yeah, it's
Anna Sten.
Anna, unfortunately. Now, this is terrible, but we have to report it. She was apparently such a flop for Goldwyn that stockholders and executives at the studio started referring to her as Anna Stench because of the stink of the box office.
Poor Anna.
Yeah. So Goldwyn, of course, loses interest. Her contract is dissolved. She does go on to star in a few more films, but none of them really do much for her.
No,
right?
and eventually, like in around 1948, she basically retired. She devoted her life to her husband, who was director Eugene Frankel, and their daughter. So she knew when to get out.
Yeah. Let's talk about Isa Miranda.
Isa Miranda. Now, this was Italy's version of Garbo or Dietrich.
Okay.
She was born in Milan, and she started out doing bit parts in Italian movies, and she finally landed a role in this Max Ophüls film, La Signora di Tutti. That movie was from 1934, and her performance really got the attention of Paramount Pictures.
Okay.
So they had high hopes that she would soon be competing with Garbo and Dietrich.
And they even dubbed her, right, the Italian Dietrich?
They did. She was the Italian Dietrich. So they had created this femme fatale persona for her. They gave her the lead role opposite Ray Milland in Hotel Imperial in 1939.
Right.
The film bombed.
Okay.
Moviegoers just did not seem to take to Isa Miranda. She followed it up with a couple of other movies, Adventures in Diamond in 1940 opposite George Brent, but then again it bombed. She just didn't have that magic.
Right.
I think people realized it pretty quickly, and that was that.
She got out of her contract. She went back to Europe. I do remember her, though, in Summertime, David
Yes.
Lean's film shot in Italy with Katharine Hepburn, and she was lovely in that film.
Yeah. She's also in the Yellow Rolls Royce in 65 with Rex Harrison and Ingrid Bergman and Jean Moreau.
Wow.
So she had a few supporting roles later.
Right.
But never quite took down Garbo or Dietrich.
Well, before we move on to others like Ingrid Bergman, let's throw out our Hollywood pop quiz.
Well, speaking of lookalikes and threats and also rans, there was a contender to be the new Clark Gable that had a big impact on the career of Marilyn Monroe. This actor and his wife took Marilyn under their wing when she was a fledgling starlet, and they paid for her dramatic courses, and they really helped her along the way. And there were lots and lots of rumors that this actor was also romantically involved with Marilyn Monroe. Who is the Clark Gable wannabe who did this?
All right, we'll have the answer to this week's pop quiz and more lookalikes after this.
Steve and Ed will be right back, but first another stop on our Hollywood tour. If you've ever seen Singin' in the Rain, you remember that hilarious scene where the director tries to hide microphones and plants and even sewn into Gene Hagen's dress to record sound for the movie. Well, this wasn't too far from technical problems that faced filmmakers when sound arrived in the late 1920s. You see, suddenly in addition to lighting, camera movement, blocking, and performance, they had a new challenge: where to hide the microphone. Now, the idea of sticking a mic on the end of a long pole first came into play in Hollywood in 1928. That's when director William Wellman was on the set of the Louise Brooks film Beggars of Life. And producer David O. Selznick was there on set when Wellman had a disagreement with the sound engineer on whether the microphone should be moved. Selznick later said, quote, "Sound was relatively new, and at that time the sound engineer insisted the microphone be steady. Wellman, who had quite a temper in those days, got really angry, took the microphone himself, hung it on a boom, gave orders to record, and then moved it. What's more, film historian Richard Schickel claims the item on which the microphone was first hung was a repurposed broomstick, and thus the boom mic was born. Now, back to Steve and Nan from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. We wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week, David Nichols. Thank you so much, David, for listening, for sharing the pod with friends on Facebook. We so appreciate it. And for just being a classic cinema fan.
Thank you, David.
And an amazing writer, by the way. Just adding that in. Let's jump into Ingrid Bergman.
Yeah, there was definitely a movement to provide Hollywood with a new Ingrid Bergman.
Yes, and she brought such a freshness and a naturalness, as you talk
Yes.
about in the blog. And so I love that that was the standard that they were trying to emulate.
Yeah, because Ingrid Bergman, when David O. Selznick discovered her, she brought to Hollywood a fresh new take on a leading lady. She wasn't as affected. She wasn't overly made up.
Yes.
She really was more of a natural beauty, but she also had a very natural acting style, which was new because most of the actors in Hollywood were trained and it was a little affected, a little dramatic, but she had a really natural elegance to her acting.
Selznick did try to push her into the opposite of what you just
Yes.
described. He tried to push her into that kind of femme fatale sort of look.
An artificial look.
Artificial,
Yeah,
that's a great
yeah.
word. But she pushed back, God
Yeah.
bless her.
She liked to be makeup free. She liked to just let her natural beauty come out. And same with her acting style. She wanted to be very natural.
As we know, she went on to win 3 Academy Awards and was involved in a Hollywood scandal.
She was kind of ostracized from Hollywood for quite a while when she was pregnant by her lover, Italian director Roberto Rossellini, while she was still married. But of course, Hollywood has a very short memory. And in the mid-50s, she was welcomed back and she starred in Anastasia. She won an Oscar. She went on to appear in many, many more movies and just became an icon of cinema. So of course, if there's one icon, why can't there
Why
be
not
two?
be- So let's talk about the one that Warner Brothers came up with, and that's Vivica Lindfors, who was a native of Sweden as well.
Yeah, another Swede. You know, and this was, as you said, this was Warner Brothers' hope of rivaling Ingrid Bergman. Lindfors was also, like Ingrid Bergman, a natural beauty and very talented. Her acting style was probably less subtle and less naturalistic than Ingrid Bergman's, but she was good. She was a good actress. They introduced her to the American public as the female lead opposite Dennis Morgan in a B movie called To the Victor from 1946. You know, the film wasn't the splashy launch the studio had hoped for her.
Okay.
But they still had high hopes that she could rival Bergman.
So they put her in a film opposite Errol Flynn, Adventures of Don Juan in 1948.
Which is a very good film, and she's really wonderful in it.
So that helps. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not really a showcase for
It was
her.
a hit, you know, but it was definitely was Errol Flynn's movie. It
Okay.
wasn't hers.
Right.
They kept her busy. You know, they put her in movies such as Night Unto Night, 1949 with Ronald Reagan, Dark City, 1950 with Charlton Heston and Elizabeth Scott, Journey into Night, 1951 with Sterling Hayden, and Riders of Vengeance, 1952 with Richard Conte.
But for whatever reason, she just didn't seem to click with audiences, and she decides to head off to Broadway to do some theater.
Yes. And kind of commenting on that a little bit, when I look at her performance, I look at Ingrid Bergman's performance, there was a coolness and a detachment that Vivica Lindfors had that Ingrid Bergman didn't
Did
have.
not. She
Ingrid
was
Bergman
warm.
had warmth, and,
Yeah.
and she's somebody that drew you in, where I think there was a coolness to Lindfors that was a little off-putting.
She did continue to work in TV and film, and she even won an Emmy in 1990 for a guest appearance on the family drama Life Goes On, but she never quite hit it
Nope.
on the big screen like Ingrid Bergman
Only
did.
one Ingrid.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about another fabulous actress, Marilyn Monroe.
Well, this might be the one that everybody tried to replicate.
Yes.
I mean, she was such a phenomenon with that breathy little girl sexuality, which was so unusual in the time, and it was so appealing, and she became such a hit that everybody had to have a piece of it.
And let's talk about a couple of those women. We've talked before about Jan Sterling.
Yes.
She was our star of the month.
Yeah.
And she definitely was one of the women.
She was, and she had a really decent career, but I think Jan Sterling, and also to a bigger degree, Sherry North, who we're going to talk
Yes.
about, they got out from under the sex symbol shadow pretty quickly and forged careers as really great character actresses, which provided them stardom and longevity.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of these other women, how many times have you heard of Jean Carmen or Carol Omot or Martine Carroll or Greta Thyssen or Barbara Payton, Barbara Lang, Beverly Michaels? There were so many of them that just, they tried to be the sex symbol, it failed, they went away.
Yeah.
Where these two really carved out great careers for themselves.
So since we've talked about Jan before, let's really talk a little bit more about Sherry North, who I remember from television. What an actress. Oh my gosh, appeared in every television show you can think of.
Yeah, you know, and Sherry, I knew Sherry really well.
You did? Oh my gosh, I love her.
A little story about me. I never had any interest in being an actor ever, but I ended up taking acting classes from Sherry North.
Oh wow, I bet she was an amazing teacher.
She was the most incredible, lovely, funny, salty woman.
Oh, yeah.
I loved her. I loved her so much. But anyway, Sherry got her start when Marilyn Monroe refused to appear in the movie How to Be Very, Very Popular in 1955. Marilyn was notorious for turning down parts or refusing parts. Well, they brought in Sherry to be a threat. They said, all right, Marilyn, we're going to bring in this younger, prettier girl and we'll put her in the movie with Betty Grable.
Right.
So after a few more Marilyn Monroe hand-me-down roles that were offered to Sherry North, Sherry got a little wise to it all, and she started appearing in movies that were a little more substantial.
Yeah.
You know, one in particular that I love, and it's such a good movie if you can see it. It's called No Down Payment.
With Tony Randall.
She played Tony Randall's wife, and it's such a great movie. It's all about these couples that live in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and it's a little soapy, but it's just all about trying to get ahead and just trying to live the American dream and what all that does to you.
Yeah.
It's so good. So North soon honed her skills, and she was in well-regarded movies such as Charlie Varick, 1973, with Walter Matthau, The Shootist, 1976, with John Wayne, and Telefon, 1977, with Charles Bronson. She later showed up on television. She did The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Archie Bunker's Place, Magnum P.I. You know, she even played Kramer's mother in Seinfeld.
What a career.
Yeah, she received 2 Emmy Award nominations during her prolific career and really had a lovely, long career.
Yeah, lovely actress.
She's just a wonderful, wonderful lady.
Let's touch on another famous blonde, like Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield.
Yes, Jane Mansfield. I mean, she was definitely brought in to be a threat to Marilyn Monroe. She was just blatantly groomed in the likeness of Marilyn, and in varying degrees and success, had a career that was a little bit like Marilyn's.
So she had a contract at Warner Brothers in the early 50s, didn't get much traction. She's another one that left Hollywood to appear on Broadway. Maybe I just need to go appear on Broadway. That's all I need to do. Then the career will just be like,
Exactly. Leave Hollywood, go to Broadway, become a hit, and then they'll want you back.
All right, no, want me back. But what she's in on Broadway is pretty spectacular. It's Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter in 55. She gets the attention of 20th Century Fox, and they go, okay, baby, come on. Come back to Hollywood.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they even promoted her as Marilyn Monroe king size.
That's just horrific.
It's horrible.
Yeah, that's horrible. That's horrible. What does that even mean? I don't even want to know.
You know, and they did that promo because they wanted to coerce Monroe back because she had walked out of her contract, moved to New York, and was studying acting with Lee Strasberg. So this was their attempt to get Monroe back on the Fox lot.
Yeah. Well, and she does have some success. You know, as you said, after Lee Strasberg, Mansfield goes on to play the dramatic role in The Wayward Bus in 1957, John Steinbeck's novel, based on his novel. And she's moving away from that blonde bombshell. She receives a Golden Globe Award and New Star of the Year, sharing the award with Carol Baker and Natalie Wood.
And then they did a filmed version of Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter in 1957. And this is what really, really put Jane Mansfield on the map, and her star power became apparent. Because she did. She had talent. She was very comedic, and she had a great image, but she just didn't quite have the vulnerability, I think, of Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
You know, of course, she went on to do other things, but I think it was a very short reign, and I think she soon drifted back into sort of B movies and desperate publicity stunts and night nightclub appearances and kind of went that route, which was sort of the end of her career. And as we all know, she tragically died in a horrific car crash outside of New Orleans when she was on her way to a nightclub engagement.
And you might not know that her daughter is Mariska Hargitay, the wonderful actress that has been on Law and Order Special Victims Unit for, I think, about 20 years now.
At least.
And she's a beauty.
She is a beauty.
See her mommy.
It's funny, I don't see Jane Mansfield in Mariska Hargitay.
Well, it's probably, she has darker hair.
I see Mickey Hargitay more than I see Jane Mansfield.
Yeah.
And I wish we had time to talk about so many other Marilyn wannabes, because there were some really interesting women who vied for the title. You know, there was Mamie Van Doren, who's still alive. She's still with us. Barbara Nichols, who actually had great comic timing and sort of like Sherry North became a character actress and had a pretty impressive career. Even England had their own Marilyn Monroe in Diana Dors. And then we had CLEO Moore, who was this Louisiana beauty who eventually ran for governor of Louisiana. She was once married. This is kind of interesting. She was once married to the youngest son of Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana, who was the model for Robert Penn Warren's novel, All the King's Men.
Wow.
But anyway, fascinating women also were Marilyn Monroe threats that never really quite took off.
Yes. Let's finish up this week's episode by talking about the Grace Kelly lookalikes, or the studios that tried to find their version of Grace Kelly, who I don't think anybody can replace or copy Grace Kelly. She is one of a kind.
Grace Kelly had that lovely, cool elegance about her that was so hard to duplicate. And when Grace Kelly said yes to Prince Rainier of Monaco, she said goodbye to Hollywood, which, sent the studios scrambling to find a new version of her.
Especially Alfred Hitchcock, because Grace was his protege. His muse, that's a better word. And one of the first people that he chooses is an actress by the name of Tippi Hedren, who I'm sure that we're familiar with. I know Tippi Hedren and the Birds gave me nightmares for many, many years as a child.
Exactly, because when Grace Kelly decided to leave Hollywood, she had committed to Alfred Hitchcock to making the movie Marnie. But once she got engaged, the citizens of Monaco objected to her appearing in a film, especially a film as a sexually disturbed thief.
Okay.
So, Hitchcock scrapped that movie for a while, and he ended up going into production on The Birds, where he, as you mentioned, he found Tippi Hedren off of a Pepsi commercial. He kind of became obsessed with her, cast her in The Birds, which went on to be a big hit. Yes. It launched Tippi Hedren's career.
And I think she's perfect in that film. Oh. She's cool and collected, and she doesn't do much, which is kind of perfect because you can read into her performance so many different things about what happens in that film.
Absolutely. Well, when Hitchcock did get back around to doing Marnie, he also cast Tippi Hedren.
Right.
By this time, Hitchcock, though, he'd become obsessed with Tippi Hedren, and he instigated all these unwanted sexual advances on the young actress. She resisted, and as a result, Hitchcock withheld her contract, which kept her from working with anybody else for several years. He really punished her for turning him down.
Which is so unfortunate because it was at the height of her career. And
she never really recovered after that.
Her post-Hitchcock career, she stars with Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren in The Countess from Hong Kong.
Which is such a misfire of a movie. I mean, everybody's so miscast in that movie. It's a mess.
Doesn't even,
it was Charles Chaplin's final film as a director.
Okay.
But it just wasn't very good.
And then we're into the 70s, and Tiger by the Tail, Satan's Harvest, Mr. King Street's War. Well, The Herod Experiment, 1973.
That was a decent movie.
But she kind of moves on to television, and that was that.
Yeah, she kind of got a resurrection of her career in the 90s once her actress daughter, Melanie Griffith, became famous. I think she and Melanie started doing things together.
Yeah.
And she's also the grandmother of Dakota Johnson.
Right.
So quite a little lineage there.
Yeah. Another actress that I would love to talk about is Dina Merrill.
Yes, I love Dina Merrill. I mean, she was the real deal because Grace Kelly was Blue Blood Philadelphia. Dina Merrill was the serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post's daughter and the daughter of stockbroker E.F. Hutton.
Oh,
so
Post and Hutton, that is a little bit of money.
She came with a certain pedigree that actually rivaled Grace Kelly's own pedigree.
And she really had that in her performances. I mean, you talk about Desk Set, talk about a feature film debut, 1959, Katharine Hepburn. She plays one of the assistants, and she's delightful.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, she's perfect casting.
Yeah, she is. It was quite an auspicious beginning. Of course, Dina Merrill went on to have a decent career. She made movies, but she never quite displaced Grace Kelly. But another hopeful that I thought they brought into the mix was Dolores Hart. You know, she was this lovely, wonderful actress who started out as Elvis Presley's love interest in Loving You in 1957. She did several more movies until she decided that she didn't want to be a Hollywood actress anymore. She wanted to be a nun. And she ended up joining a convent. And after her final film, which was
I think it was Come Fly With Me,
Come Fly
right?
With Me from 1963, after a publicity campaign, she had a promotional stop in New York. And after that promotional engagement, she took a one-way car ride to her new abbey in Connecticut, where she has been living happily ever since.
I love that.
I think that's fantastic.
I wonder if her name is Sister Dolores, if she took another name.
I think she took another name.
Nuns
And
do
if
take
you
other
haven't
names.
seen it, there's an incredible documentary from 2011 about her and her life called God is Bigger Than Elvis.
Oh.
And it's a really well-made
that.
documentary. So
Okay,
if you
I'm
want to
gonna
know more
check that
about
out.
Dolores Hart, check that out.
All right, we're not going to be able to give her as much time as I would like, but this final lady is Hope Lang.
We love Hope Lang.
We love Hope Lang. I think a lot of us grew up watching her on television, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, but
Yes.
she's quite a wonderful actress and starred in many, many films. I guess the one that I'm thinking of that she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for an Oscar
Yes.
is Peyton Place in 1957.
Oh, well, her film debut was Bus Stop.
Yeah,
where do you go from there?
Exactly.
You know, she played that wonderful, sweet waitress in William Inge's classic play, which is turned into a movie, Bus Stop, which also starred Don Murray, who became her husband.
Right, they end up getting married.
They did.
And she does a lot of other films. Frank Capra's final film, Pocketful of Miracles in 61 with Betty Davis and Glenn Ford, who will be a key person, and
Yes.
Margaret.
Oh, don't forget The Best of Everything with Joan Crawford.
Yeah, I mean,
Which is a kind of an office power play drama.
Yeah. So in Pocketful of Miracles, Lang is playing against Glenn Ford. The two of them end up falling in love, and it leads to her divorce from Don Murray.
Sorry, Don.
Yeah. But she does go on pivoting to television, where she thrived on The Ghost and Mrs. Muir.
I love that show.
I do too. For the longest time, I didn't even know there was a film.
Oh, you thought it was just a TV show.
I thought it was just a TV show.
Yeah.
But she's wonderful in that, and she won 2 Emmy
She won
Awards.
2 Emmys for that. Isn't that
Yeah.
amazing? And I love her in Blue Velvet as Laura Dern's mother in 1986. So good. I think
Yeah.
David Lynch handpicked her for the role.
Yeah. I wish we had time to talk about Rock Hudson lookalikes and Errol Flynn and so many
John
others.
Garfield.
Yes, there's so many others.
Well, you know, and if you want to know about some of these, you can always go back to the original blog, because
Yes.
this was based on a blog post I did a couple years ago. And so if you want to read more, check out www.frombeneaththehollywoodsign.com.
I think it's time for the answer to our Hollywood pop quiz.
What was the question?
The question was, who was one of the
Oh, right.
lookalikes that helped Marilyn Monroe in her career? And it was one of the Clark Gable lookalikes, if I'm not mistaken.
It might have helped her in more ways than just her
We don't
career.
know.
We don't know.
We can't
Allegedly.
verify or deny,
Yes.
but yes.
Well, it was actually John Carroll, who was a really wonderful actor, but he and his wife They helped Marilyn Monroe early on in her career. And a lot of speculation about whether that relationship was just professional and friendly, or
Right,
if it
or
was
something more.
Yeah, romantic.
Yes.
We'll never know.
Yes, we'll never know. Well, we have a big favor to ask you all. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review and like us on social media. And if you don't like us, don't do that.
Keep it to yourself.
Keep it to yourself. But our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign, and we'd sure appreciate a 5-star review on wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple or any of the other fine places.
And please keep those emails coming. We love them. info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor, Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.
Welcome back for another interesting episode.
We hope it's interesting. It's interesting to us. That's okay.
Try that again. I went up
I sort of liked that. I sort of liked that.
Oh, that's funny. All right. Okay.
You know, that might make a good Easter egg at the end.
I know. Like, we hope. Please be
We
interesting.
hope.